Well, the next accusation that's sometimes brought against dispensationalists is that dispensationalists are date setters. I hear this quite a lot, and it's unfortunate that some prominent dispensationalists are, in fact, guilty of date setting. We'll discuss that. But also, I'll make the case that this isn't limited to dispensationalists, so it's not something that's only dispensationalists do. Instead, date setting's a really widely practiced art. We'll talk about this as we go through here. So, along the lines of some dispensationalists are date setters. One example of date setting that's very unfortunate is by the late Pastor Chuck Smith, kind of founder of the Calvary Chapel movement, and was guilty of this. And it seems to have spread also through Calvary Chapel. Mike Winger, who I'm about to introduce you to here, is a Calvary Chapel pastor, has a great podcast and video channel called The Bible Thinker, I believe it is, and very even-handed. And he is again, went to Calvary Chapel Bible College, and here's what he has to say.
And all that to say, while I'm deeply grateful for Pastor Chuck Smith, he did predict that Jesus would return in 1981. Like, that really happened. And I'm sorry, that Jesus would come for his church in 1981. The rapture would happen in 1981, and that in 1988 there would be the second coming. And so there was a 7-year tribulation there. And he predicted it a number of times. Also, this issue was based on scripture being taken out of context. And that same scripture is still being taken out of context regularly inside my own circle of Calvary Chapel. So can I say this? And
So there you have it. Sometimes dispensationalists are date centers. They've in fact set dates for Jesus' coming. Now, I will point out that those who defend Pastor Chuck, and let me just say, I began my Christian walk in the Calvary Chapel movement. Was really encouraged to read my Bible. I've changed quite a bit since then in my theology, but I found Pastor Chuck and the whole movement to be very helpful for me. So let me just say in his defense and what other Calvary Chapel pastors might say, Pastor Chuck never said, "Thus saith the Lord." He never made an explicit prediction, a prophetic prediction. And I think that's true what Mike Winger's talking about there, that this continues in the Calvary Chapel movement. I think that continues to be the case. I'd be surprised if there's men within the Calvary Chapel movement that are making a "Thus saith the Lord" sort of prophetic prediction. Rather, I think what we saw in Pastor Chuck, and maybe some of these other men as well, is not only sloppy exegesis, but also kind of a reckless misinterpretation of some of the Bible. In Pastor Chuck's case, and I think what Mike Winger is referring to specifically here is Mark 13, verses 28 through 30, which is taken out of context and kind of manipulated. Let me read that for us. You could see it there on the screen. You could follow along. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. Well, people play with that generation. What does this mean? How long a period of time is that? Number of different ways that they take this verse out of context and misinterpret it and misapply it. So again, this is a favorite verse, I think, for date setters. Just remind you here of, I think, what Louis Sperry Chafer says in his systematic theology, that the Church is told to basically not look for signs, but look for the coming of the Lord, the rapture. Israel is told to look for signs, and this is Mark 13 is in a context where Jesus is speaking to the sons of Israel here. But let's go on. Date setting is not confined to dispensationalists. In fact, if we dig down and look, it's an old and wisely practiced habit. I like what Tommy Ice said here in a paper that's available online. I've got the link there for you. It says date setting of the second coming has been more widely prevalent through church history than many of our day may think. Such notables as John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, and Jonathan Edwards are only a few of the well-known Christians who have engaged in the art. So it definitely predates the date usually given for dispensationalism, and spreads across all kinds of reformed sort of exegetes. When we look at the history of date setting, again, we see it hasn't just been dispensationalists making these predictions. There's a group called the Anglo-Israelites, that is, people who believe that the people of England and America are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, that so-called lost tribes, the 10 tribes. They were date setters. Jehovah's Witnesses, also known as Russellites or Millennial Dawnites or Rutherfordites, have engaged in date setting, as has different groups of Adventists, Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, First-day Adventists. Mormons as well. Although the Mormon Church would deny it, it's pretty clear that their founder, their founding prophet, quote unquote, was Joseph Smith, did engage in date setting himself. So again, not restricted to just dispensationalists. Here's a list of various individuals, and admittedly, sometimes they would be associated with dispensationalism, that have set dates since the late 1800s and into the mid 1900s. The predictions were basically calculations that were based on sometimes bizarre sorts of things. For example, several of the predictions are based on the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which had been discovered in the late in the 1800s or early 1900s. And the calculations are based on the dimensions of various aspects of that pyramid. The speculation is based around trying to calculate the length of the time of the Gentiles, which is mentioned in Luke 21:24. And then a number of people tried to come up with dates based on their calculations of when creation happened. So they're looking at 6,000 years from the creation of Adam. When is that? Well, that must be the time of the return, the beginning of that millennial kingdom that lasts 7,000 years of the earth. More recently, various schemes of date setting, and this time I think it's often dispensationalists, have been based on the typological significance of Israel's feast, especially the fall feasts. So people look at those feasts, draw parallels between those feasts and various end time events, and then from that calculate what's happening. The analysis that I have there, that list is from I think it was a master's thesis that's available online. Again, you can see the reference there. You can go look that up yourself directly. As we look at church history, though, I think it becomes clear that Date setting is kind of endemic. In fact, we can say, perhaps anyway, that it's part of the system of a historicist approach to prophecy rather than dispensationalism. Now, a historicist approach would take the events of Revelation 2 and 3, those churches there, and try to associate each church with a particular period of church history. And then by understanding what period of church history you're in, you can make a estimation as to when the rapture might occur or Jesus might return. So Tommy Ice points this out again in that article that's available online. Says there's less date setting going on now than there was 150 years ago because this historicist approach was much more popular 150 years ago. He says the historicist approach dominated amillennialism, postmillennialism, and even premillennialism during that period of time. And by its very nature, I highlighted that is, it's almost part of the system. By its very nature, it's given to date setting. Since the historicists believe that the current church age is kind of fulfilling progressively the sequence of Revelation, building up to Christ's return in chapter 19. So again, if you're taking that historicist approach, which people still do that today, amillennialists and postmillennials particularly, they are apt to then associate where we're at in that historicist approach and how much time we have left. And you could see how easy it is to make the leap into when Jesus is going to return. Now, again, my point here is not to point fingers at people, but it's to make the case or make the point that date setting is not part of dispensationalism. In fact, we can say that it's fundamentally inconsistent with dispensationalism. Because if we consistently apply the dispensational hermeneutic, which is taking scripture in its plain voice, its plain natural, literal way, then we come to the conclusion that the rapture is actually a signless event. It can happen any time, that there is could happen any moment. Again, quoting Tommy Ice here, since the pre-trib rapture was always understood by dispensational futurists, that is, not dispensational historicists, but futurists, to be an any moment possibility in a signless event, then it's logically inconsistent and even perhaps contradictory to attempt to date the rapture. In other words, dating the rapture is antithetical to dispensational premillennialism. If a dispensationalist does that, they are violating the dispensational hermeneutic. So, to sum up, we can say here that date setting, unfortunately, admittedly, is true of some dispensationalists, but it's not limited to dispensationalism, nor is it a feature of a dispensational hermeneutic or theology. Rather, it's attributed to poor exegesis, poor, even reckless interpretation of a Bible verse, and the use of a dispensational hermeneutic, if it's consistently applied as dispensationalism asserts that it should be, will in fact preclude date setting altogether. So I would conclude from this that, again, as in the other areas, that it's unfair and unfounded to characterize date setting as either characteristic of dispensationalists, or characteristic of dispensationalism.